My name's Donovan Bigelow. I'm the psychology instructor here at Renton Technical College. This is the fourth lecture in my series on human relations in the workplace, the psychology of human relations. No lectures on human relations would be complete without an in-depth discussion of leadership. Now, I want you all to think about this a little differently than perhaps you've heard about it in the past. I want you to think about it not just from the perspective of a worker looking up, thinking about what leadership styles and what leaders do in their particular place. That's important. We're going to cover that. But I also want you to keep in mind that this is about you. Not just about somebody else, but about you. At some point in your careers, almost inevitably, almost all of you are going to be in some form of leadership position. And I want you to think about it primarily from that position. How do I execute my duties as a leader? How do I inspire confidence in my subordinates? And it doesn't matter if you're the CEO of a corporation or a group leader on a small project in a local shop. The principles remain the same, whatever level you're at. And here's the complicated part. People have been studying leadership since there have been leaders for thousands of years. People have wondered, what makes a good leader? And the strange part about this is that there's no consensus. There's no consistent research. If you look at page 19 of the lecture notes, part 1, leadership styles, 70 years of research on leadership traits, and the bottom line is it's inconclusive. There are no studies out there that say this or this or this technique, this or this or this personality style will make you a good leader. And I think it'll become clearer why in just a few minutes. Okay. And yet, even if the research says a particular leadership style can't be isolated, one thing is clear. Most of you know a good leader when you see one. Most of you understand what it's like to work under a good leader versus a bad one. And so over the years, there have been at least some parameters. These are the parameters that most of the best research has suggested are the traits that the best leaders have across the board. The Giselli study, 1971. Supervisory ability. Does the person in the leadership position have the ability to work with subordinates in a way that gets them to get the job done? Need for occupational achievement. It's one of the factors that seems almost universal is that the leader, him or herself, seems driven to get the job done, to be a leader, to succeed through the ranks in ways that others simply are not. Intelligence, obviously. There is almost no chance someone with an 85 IQ is going to be a leader. It isn't automatic. Intelligence isn't the only thing. If you've got 130 IQ, that doesn't destine you for leadership. A lot of other factors are in play. But there's no question that intelligence is one of the key factors. But I want to add something to that. It's not just intelligence. It's how well you use the intelligence you have. 130, 140 IQ, randomly not applied, not motivated, will never be a leader. An average person, highly motivated, using all the skills they have, is much more likely to be a successful leader than just someone with raw intelligence. Decisiveness. Maybe that's the core of what leadership is, the ability to make a decision and execute it. That's what leaders do. And I think the next point, initiative, that's part and parcel of decisiveness. Can they take the initiative? Can they take charge? Can they make things happen? When something bad happens in the room, if there's a loud, scary noise, who does everybody turn to? All right? I think if you look at these 5 things as a general rule, you will see that the folks that have these traits, perhaps more than others, they're the ones we turn to when something happens. Right down below that, there's another study, 1980, by the Wall Street Journal. 3 factors that make sense if you think about them. A good leader has integrity. What does that mean? Honesty, consistency, reliability. Right? You know what you're getting. They're not two-faced. They don't talk behind your back. They don't say one thing and then do something else. Integrity is central to leadership. Industriousness. I've never met a leader who didn't work hard. There is no leadership. The leaders usually get there first in the morning and leave last at night. Being a leader doesn't mean sitting behind your desk, smoking a big cigar, giving orders to the underlings. Being a leader in the real world of business means the leader is most of the time working as hard or harder than anybody else on the team. the ability to get along with people. Unless you have such absolute power that you can lead by fear alone, great leadership requires some sense of people management, some ability to look around the room and understand people. I think that's probably the core of a human relations lecture series. How do you understand yourself? How do you understand the people around you? How do you understand what's necessary to interact with them? If you're a leader, how do you understand what's necessary to motivate them to get the job done? Now, here's why I think that 70 years of research has been inconclusive on identifying specific leadership traits. Leadership is always an integration of these 5 or 6 things: the leader, the people, the mission, the organization, and the resources. And that can vary so dramatically in so many different areas and places and times that one kind of leader will not work in all of them. So you, wherever you are, have at least the potential. You may not have all of these traits or techniques or ways of being in the world, but if you have enough of them, and if things line up, your particular style consistent with the people you have to work with, the particular mission of your organization, and what resources you have available to you, then there seems to be much less of a limit than we used to think. All of you sitting around the table, virtually all of you. Okay, honestly, not everybody, but many of you, probably more than you think, have the ability to exercise some leadership qualities. Those that do, inevitably, will do better in the organization. Now, I have some of my own that I'd like to add. First, trust. We're at the bottom of page 19 of the notes. I don't think a leader can be a leader for very long if the people below him don't trust him. Now, what is trust? How do you achieve trust in any organization? And I think you know that. It's almost instinctive. You know who to trust. You knew this in high school. You knew it in your first job. You knew it in college if you went to any college at all. You look around, and with very little interaction, you have a feeling for who's trustworthy. Trustworthy, as I see it, has several components. Are they competent? If they're not competent, you can't trust that they'll get the job done, whether they're a leader or a worker. Are they consistent? And that means reliable. Do they do what they say they're going to do? Do they do it within the time frame that they say they're going to do it? When you give them a mission, can you have some trust that it will get done as per the order? Loyalty. This one may be special. You know that a good leader evokes loyalty. You want to work for a good leader. One of my favorite examples is when I was in the Army a long time ago. We had a commander, and he was such a good guy. He was hard, he was tough, he was fair, and the thing that he did, he supported his people in a way that was sort of evocative of trust. And I had a young soldier say about him one time, I'll never forget this: "Sir, I'd follow him to the gates of hell." Now, if you're the kind of leader that evokes that kind of trust, that kind of respect, there's very little that's going to stand in your way. And I think part of that loyalty requires an openness. You want a leader to be able to listen. You want to think as a worker, and you want to be, as a leader, the kind of person who is approachable. Openness means that. Can people come to you and tell you what's going on in your organization? One of the things that causes leaders at any level to fail is that people stop talking to them, stop telling them what's going on around them. They don't know what's going on, and failure is inevitable at that point. So that's, I think, the key elements in generating trust. It's fragile, folks. If you betray someone's trust, you are almost finished as a leader. It's fragile. You know this from your personal relationships. If you're dating someone and they betray you, do you give them another chance? Maybe, but the trust that's been violated is awfully hard to reconstruct. And I think if great leaders have the ability to be trustworthy individuals consistently over time. The other thing I think great leaders do is facilitate responsibility and dependability. Can you, if you're a shop foreman, if you're a group leader, If you've got a little mission and your little organization, your little group has been tasked to execute some mission, can you give your subordinates responsibility and motivate them to execute those responsibilities efficiently and effectively? Can you help motivate the people below you to be dependable, to motivate them to want to accomplish the mission for you? You delegate the missions below and you follow up to make sure they're done. You don't ride them every minute of the time. You give them space to get the job done. You don't turn them loose and let them run and never follow up until the day the mission is accomplished. There's this balance, this back and forth. Delegate and follow up. Good leaders know where that balance is. Facilitating responsibility and dependability. I've never met a good leader who didn't know how to teach. Great leaders are great teachers. And part of teaching is being able to critique. That's the bottom of page 19. You've got to be a good teacher to be a leader, but you've also got to be able to critique in a way that motivates. If you just hammer someone for making a mistake, the odds are they're not going to try very hard the next time. If you don't call someone on the carpet when they make a mistake, then the odds are they're not going to correct themselves. Again, a balance. Teaching and critiquing. All right, top of page 20 of the notes, section 2, motivation. Every human relations course I've ever seen, every human relations text I've ever seen has extensive chapters on motivation. And the traditional understanding is fairly straightforward. Need, motive, behavior, satisfaction. There's a need, we have a motive to meet that need, we engage in behaviors to do that, and either we're successful or we fail. Probably the central factor in success is the self-motivation. Are you motivated because you have this inner desire? One of the factors in the previous section had that, the self-motivation. I think that's absolutely essential. Do you do something because you want to get it done, you want to do things, you're self-motivating, or do you sit there passively and wait to be told what to do? If you're not that kind of self-motivating person, the odds are you will stagnate in any organization. Remember what we talked about before. Competition now is global. Competition now is deadly. There is no time left for sitting on your laurels. You're not just in competition with the folks around you in the job site. We're in competition globally, and unless you can find the motivation to engage in productive work where you are when you are, the odds are you're not going to be working very long. That, if there's anything else you take away from this section of the lectures, that's probably the key one. What are your motivations? What motivates you to get the job done? If you're not sure, you need to think about it. If you're completely lost, take my psychology class. I'll help. All right. Companies need incentives. Top of page 20 of the notes. This calculation isn't really mathematical. They put it in a mathematical way for teaching purposes. Performance, the ability that you have to get the job done, or any organization, equals ability of the workers, their motivation, times the resources at their disposal. And everybody understands that without motivation at a very high level, performance is going to be lacking at best. All right, let's talk for a few minutes about those needs that are the core of most people's motivation. What needs? There's psychic needs and there are physical needs. And every textbook in Psych 100 all over the country at some place in the motivation chapter has Maslow's universal hierarchy of needs. It's generally laid out in a pyramid. The stuff at the bottom there, physiological, that's the base, and it gets smaller as it gets to the top. Simple idea. Physiological needs. You've got to breathe, you've got to drink water, you've got to have food, you've got to have clothing and shelter against the elements. Basic physiological needs. If those aren't met, nothing else counts. Get those met first. Second, safety needs. I'm a psychotherapist. Clients come to me all the time, and they're in the middle of a divorce, a child custody battle, legal proceedings, a personal health crisis, all manners of crises. And at that point, there's very little therapy being done. Step one, you've got to manage the safety needs. There's no psychotherapy on a battlefield. You got to win the war first. You got to get through the immediate crisis. The next, social needs. from the first lecture on evolutionary psychology, it ought to be clear that we are social creatures. We have a need to be with other people. Solitary confinement is punishment. It's painful for most of us to be alone. So we're going to need to be connected in some way, assuming we can get the physiological and safety needs met. Once that's all done, the needs start becoming more sophisticated. Esteem needs. I need to feel good about myself. How do you do that? How do you feel good about yourself? Everybody talks about self-esteem these days as if it's something you can go down and buy at the store. You can't. Self-esteem comes from one place, and one place only: honest, meaningful achievement. You will not get self-esteem if your teacher gives everybody an A. That's a lie. It's a myth. It doesn't work. It actually does the opposite. The subtle meaning below it is you're too weak, you're too lacking in talent to achieve in an honest competition. Self-esteem is only capable of being achieved through a sense of your own honest achievement. That's important. Now, the next level, the highest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is self-actualization. Okay, let's say I have all this stuff. What's going to give meaning to my life? If you can ask those questions, if the rest of these things are mostly handled and that question rises to the front, then you're at the very pinnacle of human experience. Good luck. Right down below that, a little simpler understanding, McClellan's relative classification. I think these are really two things. Achievement and power are really the same thing. If I'm achieving things, if I'm achieving really good things, if I'm achieving great things, then I have power. And I think there's something almost inherently, there's almost an instinct. Nietzsche called it, Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, called it will to power. Freud called it an aggressive instinct. Everybody looks around and you sort of get that people are motivated to claw their way up the hierarchy. All right, so let's just call that power and achievement. The next one is affiliation. I think that's a variation on the social needs. And this is where there's a bit of a conflict. We want to be powerful, but we want to be connected. And that, folks, I believe is the definition of Greek tragedy, because it's in that desire to be powerful simultaneously with a desire to have human connection that leads to some of our biggest mistakes. We got to be aware of it. If we're aware of it, we can see the problems coming before they blow up in our faces, hopefully. Now, if you're a leader, you got to motivate the people below you. If you're in a group, a work group, you've got to recognize that the bosses are going to be employing motivational techniques. These are the ones generally understood in human relations courses. Giving praise. You do a good job, you get patted on the head. That feels good. We all like that. We've liked it since we were 2 years old. The other side of that, I think, needs to be also talked about. Giving praise and giving criticism, or worse, or more potentially powerful, or more potentially dangerous, shaming someone. You've all had a boss who would shame you if you made a mistake, shame you most disastrously in front of the other workers. Is that a motivational technique? Yes. Does it work? The truth is it works powerfully, but there's a downside to it. It often causes resentment and causes the worker to find ways to enact little revenge scenarios. Humans are often, at a very profound level, motivated by shame. And leaders who can tap into that, but gently, carefully, and judiciously, are often quite effective when balanced with praise. How well as a leader do you set objectives? Bottom of page 20. You got to set objectives that are difficult but achievable. You can't give impossible assignments to your workers. They can't do impossible assignments, and it frustrates everyone. In order for them to be achievable, you have to be able to observe the objective being met, and it has to be measurable. There has to be some standard by which you judge whether it's been achieved or not. Go do good things is not observable and measurable. Specific, with a target date. If you can characterize an objective in a clear and concrete way and give them a time frame, it allows the workers to focus and get the job done. That isn't always possible, but it's a way to think about how to characterize objectives. How do you bring workers in? Participatively set when possible. Objectives ought to be, when it's possible, talked about not quite negotiated with the workers, but at least let them in on the process, because if they're in on the process, they're more likely to buy into the objective and therefore be more motivated to work toward it aggressively. Hopefully that objective will be accepted, and it's more likely to be accepted if they participate in forming it. Top of page 21. Motivation is often determined by how the job is designed and how enriching the job is to do. If you're just plugging a widget into a machine all day long, the job isn't designed well and it isn't very enriching, and the odds are your motivation, unless you are paid extraordinarily a lot of money, it's very hard to be motivated to do a mindless, repetitive job. So if you're a boss, if you're watching your boss engage in these motivational techniques, ask yourself the question, how might I make this job more interesting, more fulfilling, more rewarding? How might I design the job to enhance what's possible? And the last point, motivation cross-culturally. Is there really a difference? Is Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the other things, are they completely culture-bound to Western civilization? I don't think so. I think we're all human. I think the lecture, the evolutionary psychology lecture from the first hour, I think the evidence on that is pretty clear. We are all the same species. We all are motivated fundamentally by the same drives and biology. And so I think these motivational techniques are universal. You have to apply them to people with different languages, different stylistic habits of dress and interaction, different rules of etiquette. That's all true. And that's important to recognize, and that's the kind of sort of multiculturalism that I think is valid and useful. But we're human. We're all the same species, and I think these motivational techniques remain valid across cultures. Here's the problem. We all can't get what we want. We are all motivated to get a lot of things, but there aren't enough things in the world to make everybody happy. This is the downside. This is both the advantage and the danger of good and bad leadership. There's a limited quantity of what we all want, and therefore, inevitably, the competition for it is intense. That's what most good leaders understand. That's what most good workers understand. That your job isn't an entitlement, it isn't a right, it is in some ways a privilege, a limited privilege, and it's always at risk. That recognition ought to by itself motivate you tremendously. The idea of present, real, global competition, if it's clearly understood, ought to be the only motivation anybody really needs these days. Okay. Third subject in this lecture, networking. I think this one is completely underrated. I think if you don't network, you don't win. We are not isolated creatures unless you're some sort of genius who has this product that everybody wants that's solely created by you. There is no one like that, okay? You have to work with other people. And I think the ideas in most human relations texts on networking are valid. They work. And if you can stop and think about these things a little bit, your production, your job satisfaction will go up. All right, there's an old saying, everybody knows it's true. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Is that always true? To a degree, yes. Most people get jobs through connections, through personal relationships. The material on page 21 is about how to foster those relationships to enhance the chances of job acquisition, to get a job or a better one, to perform better at your current job. You need to network with people in your field. You need to figure out how the better ones are doing it. Networking is also about improving your own professional qualifications to advance within the organization. That networking is the ladder on which you climb up the organization you're in. At the very least, it allows you to stay current in your field. Who are the other workers in your field? I don't care if you're a surveyor, a nurse, an auto mechanic. Who are the better folks? Who do you want to hook up with? Who do you want to keep with you on your sort of social network, but also professional network, to make sure that you're up on the latest changes and innovations? How can you be the one that others want to be connected with? All right. To maintain mobility, Who now lives in the town you were born in? Almost nobody. We are a mobile culture. The competition that I talked about before has resulted in us being a culture that's sort of uprooted. We don't live in the same town with our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters anymore. That's almost unheard of these days. So networking will help maintain your mobility. The jobs aren't going to be within 2 miles of your home right now. Never. The last thing, develop relationships. It's very clear that human relationships aren't just a thing to be studied. We are a relating species. We're not tigers out in the jungle alone. We are a dynamic group, tribal people. We evolve that way, or we're created that way. Take your pick. We don't do well alone, and we do best when we're in groups. Small groups, but groups nonetheless. Networking is a way to develop groups that'll help you. Okay, developing your network. It sounds sort of superficial. It sounds sort of like a checklist. Okay, it's a checklist, and it's superficial. But if you apply it, it actually works. You want to be mindful when you're talking to people in your field that these are folks who you might network with. And you conduct an interview. Now, do you sit someone down with a piece of paper and a pencil in front of them? No, of course not. But you're mindful of the idea. Now, you all know someone who we might call a tool. He's always manipulating. He's always on the make. He's always trying to network in sort of an overtly power-oriented way. We don't like these people. They're annoying. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just being conscious that you need people and that people are resources and that you might be a resource for others. That's what a network is. That's why it's useful. You need to be mindful of it. You maintain it, and there might even be coalitions among networks. It's getting a little abstract now, but the idea is the same. Connections can make or break your career. Page 22. Section 4, negotiating a win-win if possible. There isn't a day that goes by that you're not negotiating with somebody over something. Who gets to do that job, who gets to do this job, how much you should get paid, how much vacation time you should get, whether you get a day off, what sick leave's all about. You negotiate stuff all the time. Most people just go, hey, I want to do this. The boss says no, you say why, you talk about it back and forth, a decision gets made and it's done. Wrong strategy. If you can use these notes to think about negotiations, at least the important ones, you got to plan. You got to think about it. Research the other party. Whoever you're negotiating with, what do they want? What are their priorities? What might be a weakness in their position that you can exploit? What are your objectives? What are you trying to do out of this negotiation, really? Can you think through, anticipate questions and objections, and prepare answers? Can you do your homework? If there's a negotiation, can you take at least a few minutes? Okay, if it's a little thing about, can someone take your shift and you'll take their shift? How long does it take to negotiate that? Not very much. Okay, that's a simple thing. And yet, take 30 seconds and think about what the parameters of the game are. What do you have that they want? What do they have that you want? How best to negotiate a win-win? People who engage in sharp practice, that's a term of art. It means people who are always digging for the last little advantage. In American culture, that's often very off-putting. It's very annoying. We don't get along well with a person who takes advantage of every little weakness we have. It feels exploitative. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just thinking about what you want and how best to get it in the context of maintaining the good and healthy work relationships that you have. All right, you can go through the rest of this list. It's fairly straightforward, but I caution you not to just blow over it. Take some time, read it, think about it, and practice it, play with it. Apply it to your life as best you can. It'll make a difference. Page 23, team dynamics and social psychology. All right. This is one of those obvious things that needs to be said. Teamwork involves working together to achieve something beyond the capabilities of individuals working alone. Folks, this is why humans have conquered this planet. By ourselves, we are weak, pathetic, we don't have claws, we don't have teeth, we can't run very fast, all right? But we have a great big frontal lobe in our brain that has amazing thinking capacities. And when we work together, we conquer the world. By ourselves, we are vulnerable. In groups, we are unstoppable. We can go to the moon. We can create nuclear power. We can create buildings, roads, inventions beyond the wildest imaginations of just a few generations ago. But it requires a division of labor. Worker productivity requires a division of labor. That Ludwig von Mises was maybe the greatest economist of the 20th century. And he tied worker productivity and the division of labor as the cornerstones of literally Western civilization, along with a constitution that fostered liberty and individual responsibility and limited government. But the economics of it, the human relations aspect of it that's critical for our purposes today, is this idea of the division of labor. You have a specialty. You have to foster that specialty. You need to be good at one or more things. And you plug that into an organization, and everyone's skills within that organization comes together, and the end result is amazingly productive, vastly more than the sum total of each individual effort. That's why teams work. That's why groups work. That's why we're having this class on human relations, because it's essential that we work together in productive ways. There are 6 billion people on this planet, and we have created, for example, an agricultural industry that is so efficient that we can feed all those people, or most of them. If the division of labor breaks down, if we don't continue to become more and more productive, then the truth is, given the number of people involved on this planet, starvation is inevitable. We have to maintain the division of labor. We have to maintain worker productivity, and that means group relationships in the workplace that can foster each other's contribution. Right. The next couple of sections, team structure, team dynamics, and on page 24, team development and leadership issues. These are always in human relations courses. They also seem, on the surface, a little superficial. And I want you to think about them, but I also want you to recognize in every one of these, there is always the human element. All right, so team structure. There's leadership, there's the composition of the team, a problem-solving and decision-making process, and a conflict resolution process. And it varies from team to team. If you can step back and look at how your particular team, however it's made up in whatever organization you're in, how it does these things, you will have insight into how to best fulfill your job. Team dynamics. Within each team, you will notice patterns of interaction, and they vary a lot depending on the individuals. What are the team's objectives? How big is it? Depending on how big it is, you have norms. You have a certain, almost a little mini culture being developed in a particular group. You know this is true. In sports teams, football teams, so the Seahawks have a certain culture. Right? New York Giants have a culture. Tampa Bay Buccaneers, kind of, sort of. Okay? So the idea is any organization is going to develop its own set of norms and sort of the feeling you get by being part of the organization. Group cohesiveness. Is the team together, or are they fragmented? How do you recognize the leaders within the team? What is the status? What is your status within the team? And how do you distinguish group roles? Okay. We can go through this stuff fairly quickly. All I want you to do is look at these words that represent the nuts and bolts, the concepts, the infrastructure, or the superstructure of any team organization. Team development. This is the team over time. It starts. There's an orientation. A leader puts a team together. Often the mission gets laid out, and there's conflicts as people sort out their roles. Dissatisfaction. That dissatisfaction is resolved, and they figure out how to work together to meet the production that's required. Often, the group is dissolved when the mission's accomplished, or they go on to some other mission with new members, and the whole process starts over again. All right, leadership issues. Variation on the theme we've talked about. How do you make a decision? How do you make a decision? If you think about it in this way, it might be useful. First, you got to define the problem. I've said for years in my classes, and I've said with my patients, the person who asks the right question is much more likely to get the right answer. Stop Ask a question. What's really going on? That's define the problem. If you can define the problem accurately, then you have a chance for making a solution. If you don't get the problem right, no matter what you do, it isn't going to work. Set objectives and criteria, generate alternatives, analyze the alternatives and select one, plan, implement the decision, and control. Okay, this is a great leadership model for making decisions. What's the problem? How to solve the problem, how to get to the objective, and how to measure criteria the accomplishing the mission. Are there alternatives? We got to keep alternatives open on the table. Somebody in your group's got a better idea. Analyze the alternatives and select one. There's got to be a process for getting everybody's input and then selecting one ultimately. That's what the leader does. And then how do you plan, implement that decision, and control along the way for variations? How do you manage when someone's not doing what they're supposed to do? The process opens up things that you recognize that you couldn't have recognized before. You all know this is true. It's easy to have a plan, you execute the plan, and variations happen. Things you didn't anticipate, things that no one could have anticipated, have to be adjusted for. When I was in the Army, we had a 5-paragraph field operations order. We had a battle plan. And the joke was, as soon as the first bullet gets fired, the plan goes out the window. I don't think that's entirely true. Every plan, if it's a good plan to begin with, usually achieves something like the objective it started with. But it never achieves it in exactly the same way. We are flexible. We have to be flexible. We have to modify based on experience. We have conquered this planet because we're the creature, when we're good, who can learn from experience. Group problem solving. I highlighted this specifically. A good leader recognizes that his or her people might have answers that he needs or she needs to know. There's got to be a process where you can get your people together and brainstorm, where ideas get tossed around in a safe environment, where nobody gets ridiculed or shamed, where you just want this sort of frothy, yeasty dynamic happening, and ideas get tossed out without condemnation, and we just play with things for a while. And it's amazing how well, if that is done well, the quality of solutions that come out of that process. Now, all of this has been good. There's some downsides to group behavior. There were 2 experiments done in the 60s. You can actually go online and look at them carefully. I'm not going to give you the details of them now, but they're called the Milgram experiment and the Zimbardo experiment. The short version is this. They put people in a situation where they thought they would react a certain way, but there were some pressures, there were some people around. And what they found, and this is something that I think most people understand as intuitively obvious, but there's psychological testing that's been validated to actually prove this is true. Individuals can be very smart. People in groups are often very stupid and sometimes very bad. I bet you know this from high school or junior high school or your first couple of jobs or secondary education. You get in a group, a sports team, a gang, a group, a social group, and somebody suggests doing something that everybody in that group knows you shouldn't do, but there's some sort of group psychology happening, some sort of group dynamic, and everybody doesn't want to be left out of the group, so you all go along with something that individually no individual would ever do by themselves. In a short version, that's the result of the Milgram and the Zimbardo experiments. People in groups are capable of giving up their own identities almost, identifying with the group, and engaging in very destructive behaviors. You've probably all seen pictures of Nazi Germany or communist Russia or communist China, where they would have these mass meetings. And you could almost see the hysteria in the groups, the Hitler salute, this chanting by the communist youth groups in China. There was almost a psychosis involved in their passionate commitment to the group. They lose their identity and become tools of the leader, often with very, very destructive results. So you've got to be careful in a group, as a leader and as a group member, that these dynamics are almost inevitable, and you'll be pulled by the group psychology to perhaps engage in behaviors that aren't good for anybody. Bottom of page 24 of the notes, the thinker who has probably explained this group psychology better than anybody else is a guy named Bion. And he described 3 different types of groups, and I won't go into the details now. But the key idea here, and the key that explains some of this almost bizarre behavior of people in groups, is that it seems that being in a group soothes us. We feel safer in a group. It feels almost like an evolutionary psychology dynamic, as if we haven't gotten away from our tribal instincts. Imagine what it was like to being in a tribe 10,000 years ago, anywhere on the planet. The human organization was the same. Small tribes, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 max, usually relatively nomadic, with a very distinct hierarchy of leadership and roles among the groups. And what would happen if someone got lost? What would happen if someone was on the outside? What would happen if someone was outcast? For most of human history, the main punishment of a group was to be thrown out of the group. What would that mean for our ancestors? It would mean death, miserable, terrible death, isolated alone in the wilderness. I think there's something about us that still reacts with that primitive. Bion thought about it almost as a psychotic process. It scares us. I think it's just terrifying. To be thrown out of a group is the scariest thing imaginable for most people. And so we're willing to subsume our own identity, sometimes our own most cherished values, to maintain identity with the group. And if that's going on, you're in trouble. If you get that, if you can stop for a minute, step back, and maybe think about, Mr. Bigelow on your shoulder. What did that guy just suggest? What kind of pressure is being put on me to correspond or to comply with this group request? Whoa, this is a problem and somebody needs to say so. If you can maintain your identity in the face of group pressure, you have achieved something that's frankly very, very hard to achieve. That will maintain your self-esteem. That's an achievement that's meaningful and useful. Okay, page 25, the top, section 5, organizational change and culture. I think this is critical. This is one of the things that nobody talks about adequately in my book. The great, again, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, if a temple is to be built, a temple must be destroyed. What does that mean? All change is resisted because it is inevitably painful psychologically. I'm a psychotherapist. I work with people every day. And what do they come into my office for? They want to change. Why don't they? Because it turns out, psychologically, very difficult. Change, the old saying is, people fear change more than death. And you know that's true. How many alcoholics change their ways without a crisis, without hitting bottom? Very few. Do they know it's bad for them? Yes. Do they have all the information they need? Yes. Changing their fundamental behavior, changing the nature of their identity almost, is a terribly painful process. Quitting smoking is the same. Changing the way you relate to people is very difficult, it turns out. Change always involves the destruction of felt security. I like things the way they are. I don't want to change. The problem is we're biological creatures. We're not a rock. Rocks don't change much over time. We're either growing and developing, or we are degenerating. The great irony, the great tragedy of human existence is there is very little security. You have to manage change. You have to recognize its inevitability and get on the wave. It's a little like surfing. It's a dangerous thing. There are sharks in the water. You're a long way from shore. The reefs are there, but you're surfing. And you look good out there on the board. If you can do that, if you can get that, you have some chance of managing. But the first thing you need to recognize is that change inevitably is painful. And it's painful from a deep place within you. Regardless of facts, beliefs, or values, primary emotions are evoked. And that's why it's painful, folks. Anytime somebody suggests a change in your organization, in your lifestyle, in the nature of your relationship, fear is evoked, anxiety is evoked, jealousy, envy is evoked, okay? So that if you don't get that, you just say no and damn the consequences. That's dangerous. I don't think there's any way to actually engage in a process of meaningful change if you don't recognize, frankly, how very often terrifying it is. And if you get that, you can take a breath, be honest about it, not deny it, and lean into that difficulty in a manageable way. If you deny it, if you pretend it's not true, you've got no basis for dealing in reality with the inevitable change you're going to be faced with. Okay. It's probably useful for just a second to talk about the types of changes you're going to be facing. Everybody that's listening to this lecture is in a program that's going to be drenched in change from the get-go. Types of changes. Number one, technological. It's impossible to imagine any program on this campus being taught the same in 5 years as it's being taught now, using the same technologies, the same techniques. We are in a rapidly changing world, technologically speaking. If you don't stay current with the innovations in your field, you will not last very long. Structural changes. You can't read a newspaper, you can't look at the internet websites that are news-based and not see how dramatically organizations are changing. Structural changes in organizations. You can see structural changes in the government going on right now. Everything is moving. The family structure that we're in, if you look at it over the last 50 or 60 years, has undergone radical change. Every organization you're in, all of your human relationships are undergoing structural change while we speak. Recognize it, be honest about it, find the internal strength to be clear and honest about it and deal with it. You'll be more successful than otherwise. Tasks change. Nobody does the same thing now that they did 5 years ago. You're going to be doing something different in 5 years from now. You've got to maintain sufficient flexibility to be able to move from task to task. It's hard to imagine that anyone will be doing the same thing in 5 years that they're doing right now. At the very least, if you're in the same job, you'll be experiencing dramatic variations in what you're required to do. And of course, the people around you are changing all the time. Relationships come and go, and to be able to manage that without crisis, without falling apart, without depression, is maybe one of our most important tasks. Again, you want more information on that, take my psychology class. Section 6, briefly, diversity, multiculturalism, and psychopathology. A couple points. We all get that in our competition-drenched world, we are now mixing the different cultures. And that is both an opportunity and a bit of a crisis sometimes. Because of the way we evolved on this planet, we very often see differences as dangerous. I think that's really the source of most racism and prejudice. We see people that are different, and there's some part of our very makeup that says, uh-oh, look out, they're not on my team, they're not from my tribe. For our ancestors, the truth was anybody that was not from your tribe was in fact, actually, literally, deadly dangerous. There's some leftover biological, genetic component that gives us that predisposition. I don't think we're ever going to change that unless or until we understand that others now may be necessary for our success and not dangerous in the same way that perhaps they would have been for our ancestors. Are others who are different from us dangerous at times? The truth is yes. Can you tease apart the biological precursors to prejudice and racism and the other as dangerous, and the advantages of working with others from different places when they have something to contribute to you? That's a much more, I think, sophisticated way of thinking about difference and multiculturalism and diversity now. Everyone praises diversity, everyone praises multiculturalism, we need to respect the other. You get that endlessly and it's become almost annoying to listen to. I want to add a layer of complexity to it that might still make it useful. Others are dangerous, absolutely. That's the nature of competition. But can you recognize the difference between the dangerous other and the other that has something to offer you? Can you be the other that has something to offer to others? If you can do that, then you're much more likely to be successful. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of my 4-part lecture series on human relations. I hope it's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed it somewhat. I hope your instructors can take what I've given, break it into sections, and expand your particular program requirements into this material, and I hope it gives you the basis for thinking about your own career, your own productivity. I hope it makes your life better. Good luck, and best wishes. Goodbye.